welcome to the Politics Chicks podcast. I'm Christy Branham.
And I'm Monica Haley.
Today, we're joined by Ingrid Lyons, Executive Director of Save the Boundary Waters. Ingrid first fell in love with the Boundary Waters as a 4-year-old visiting Ely with her family from New York City, and she spent the last decade working to protect one of America's most treasured wilderness areas.
Since joining Save the Boundary Waters in 2015, Ingrid has served as a regional organizer, development director, interim executive director, and now she leads the organization as its executive director. She holds degrees in environmental studies from Carleton College and nonprofit management from the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School.
Ingrid, welcome to the Politics Chicks podcast. We're so glad to have you here today.
Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So before we jump into prepared questions, has anything happened in just the past few days regarding Boundary Waters or the Twin Metals project that you think our listeners should know about?
No, thankfully we've had a quiet few days here on the front. So no.
Well, no news is good news, hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah. And many of our listeners have heard of the Boundary Waters, but have never experienced them themselves. If someone has never been there, how would you describe it? I mean, I've been there. Monica, have you been there?
I have
The Boundary
not.
Waters?
I'm a bad Minnesotan. I have never been there.
Yeah. How would you describe it? And why is it really is a magical place. So why don't you give our listeners a little mental tour of what it's like?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and Monica, you're not a bad Minnesotan. You know, there's so many people who absolutely love the Boundary Waters, even if they've never been there. They support the idea. They love that we have it because, you know, as the land of 10,000 lakes, which isn't even accurate, we have more like 12,000 lakes. You know, places like the Boundary Waters are really central to who Minnesotans are. And what makes the Boundary Waters particularly unique is, I mean, there are so many things that make it unique, but it's really a labyrinth of really deeply interconnected fresh water that is remote and very wild. So the Boundary Waters was, you know, one of the original wilderness areas set aside in the 1964 Wilderness Act. And that's the highest level of protection granted to landscapes in our country. It's meant to really preserve sort of this wild character of a place. And so in the Boundary Waters, the vast majority of it, you're not allowed to use any motors. It's a dark sky sanctuary, one of the darkest places in the United States and in the world, where you can see incredible stars. You won't run into very many people. It's a truly unique landscape, and people travel it in unique ways. You know, the primary mode of transportation, because of all the water, is canoeing and portaging.
Mhm.
And so it's a really a unique recreation experience here in America writ large. But, you know, we don't have very many wilderness areas in the Midwest either. So this area really stands out as a crown jewel of our nation.
You first visited when you were 4. Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. My dad is from Minneapolis originally, but had never really ventured to northern Minnesota. So it was real sort of happenstance that we found our way from, you know, at that point, my neighborhood of 8 million people to Ely, Minnesota, which has a population of about 3,200 people. So it was a significant shift, but it was, you know, critical to who I am today and what I do today, of course.
So 4-year-old Ingrid is paddling in the Boundary Waters. What was it about those early trips that stayed with you? And when did protecting the Boundary Waters become more than just something you loved personally?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll set the record straight that I was, the term is duffing, being a duffer, which is when you sit in the middle and you're not useful at all. You know, the people in the front and the back are the ones paddling, and I was just, you know,
Add that to our lexicon. We're going to start calling people duffers.
Yeah,
I might be a duffer.
No. Yeah, I think what stood out to me was just, you know, I loved the urban parks that I grew up with, and I just didn't know a place like the Boundary Waters could exist. And then to see those things in such sharp contrast, you know, within a week we'd driven from Brooklyn to Ely, and I learned to use canoe maps with just as much skill as, you know, navigating the New York City subway system. It was just a really kind of interesting dichotomy to grow up with. And I think what stuck out to me as a kid was just this sort of wild sense of freedom. As far as the eye can see, you're really deeply immersed within a really incredible environment, and you're with animals and plants and I'd never experienced that few people, I guess, is probably a good way to put it. And it became protecting the boundary waters kind of became a bit more personal to me when, we continued to go up to the boundary waters area, and we actually purchased a bit of land just outside the boundary waters off the Echo Trail. And went there every single year and slowly built up a sort of remote off the grid cabin. It's a water access only spot. And so it became more and more personal as, things changed in my life and I grew up and I moved from New York to the West Coast and went off to college. What remained constant was the boundary waters and northern Minnesota and Ely and this place. And once I started learning in college about public lands and how public lands belong to all Americans, right? It's this shared public trust. I became more invested in sort of the culture and politics and sort of environmental history of how we as a nation have thought about public lands and what public lands say about the state of our democracy.
Well, and just as an aside, so our dear friends have a cabin that's about 45 minutes north of Ely, and we've been there multiple times. My husband actually coincidentally was there this past weekend, and it's called the Boundary Waters Canoe area, because there are outfitters in Ely where you can actually go and buy. I mean, Ely's cute. It's got like a little main street. They have a great shop that we go to buy fudge, and it's just like total small town, right? But there's a whole economy attached to this in Ely. Like this is the livelihood. This is, where these people make their money during the tourist season. So as we go on to talk about all of these issues, we need to understand that this is a bigger economic impact than even just the boundary waters itself, as these small mom and pop shops that have been outfitting people to experience the boundary waters for decades that are going to be impacted by this.
Yeah, absolutely. The shops. And then also, there are so many camps up
Yeah.
in that area. And it's important also to know that we're not just talking about Ely, but other wilderness edge communities like Grand Marais, these places that have really adapted their local economic models and communities to having this wonderful asset in their backyard. And the camps, there are several YMCA camps. There's a Boy Scout camp, a Girl Scout camp, Voyageur Outward Bound School, just an endless number of institutions that introduce kids to the boundary waters and families every single year. So yeah, the breadth, the reach economically is really, really significant. I'm glad you said that.
And culturally too, because our kids in our school district would go to the boundary waters to do a camp when they're, what grade was it, Monica, that kids go and do?
6th grade, probably.
Yeah, they actually pack the whole class up and take them up there, and they do a camp up there and get to experience the boundary waters, like spitting distance from Canada. So it's part of our culture here for our kids to go and experience that too.
Yeah, and I think whether or not people know it in Minnesota or elsewhere, when you think about camping, you think about a fire, a lake, a pine tree, roasting marshmallows, wearing plaid. It's Minnesota. I don't think people realize that what they're picturing is Minnesota's Northwoods, really, and sort of this Americana cultural. It's very just emblematic culturally of what we think about, and when we think about camping and outdoor recreation. And I think that makes it, it's so deeply embedded culturally in Minnesota for sure. But I think subconsciously, I think it's embedded, in America too.
Well, I love that phrase, Americana, because I think that really does capture it. And you have a very unique perspective, having lived on both the East Coast and the West Coast. So now you're ensconced in the boundary waters. Why is it that people in California, in Florida, in New York, why should they care about the boundary waters?
I think something that makes our country unique is its history of protecting special places. And the boundary waters is an ecosystem that's unique to Minnesota. It's unique to the country. It's unique to the world. You can paddle to the middle of a lake in the boundary waters and dip your cup in and drink straight from the lake. Now, it's advised that you look around, and if there are beaver dams or huts in the vicinity, maybe don't do it there. But from a clean water standpoint, fresh, clean water is a increasingly rare resource in this world. And places like the boundary waters where wildlife and plants can thrive uninterrupted, where people from all across the country, all across the world can access a world-class wilderness experience for not very much money. Like you said, you can go to one of those outfitters or you can strap your crappy canoe to the top of your car in Des Moines and get on the highway and be in a world-class wilderness where you see more stars than you've ever seen in your entire life within a number of hours. So, public lands are our collective right. Folks in Florida and California and New York have just as much, of this collective ownership of these lands as we do as Minnesotans, as people who live right next to the boundary waters. And so, it's up to all of us to protect and advocate for these places. And we've seen that quite a bit as the boundary waters has been more in the news nationally, just people sort of realizing like, yeah, this is all our shared public trust. It's just like the Grand Canyon. It's just like Yellowstone. Think of the places you're most maybe personally connected to, but they exist all over the country and they are truly spectacular. And the Boundary Waters is one of those crown jewels for sure.
Why don't we just touch briefly before we move on the permitting process, because you do need to obtain a permit before you can visit the Boundary Waters. And can you explain why that is in place?
Yeah, so I mean, because it's a wilderness area, one of the charges that the U.S. Forest Service has in governing or managing that wilderness area is just making sure that it doesn't get overused. Places being overused or overloved is increasingly an issue in our country. It's so wonderful that so many people are excited to visit our nation's public lands, but a wilderness area is meant to retain its wild character. And so if it's overrun or heavily trafficked, the paths degrade, the campsites degrade, you see too many people, these kinds of things. And so the permitting system is really meant to sort of disperse the traffic over all the different entry points and over the full course of the paddling season. So you need to have a permit if you are going for an overnight trip, and basically you pick your entry point, see if it's available and the dates you like, and you say how many days you're going to go. And yeah, it's really just to manage, everybody's best experience of this wild place. If every portage is totally crammed with back and forth traffic, it is a different experience than the wilderness experience that is expected in places like the Boundary Waters. But permits become available in January, but you can always go to rec.gov and see what's available. People often will, put their permits back if they realize they can't go on a trip. So I think there's been some sort of chatter that it's increasingly difficult to get a permit for the Boundary Waters, but there's always options. So I would encourage people to take a risk on maybe an entry point they've never been to, or if they've never been to the Boundary Waters, to reach out to an outfitter and get some advice on grabbing a permit.
Did the pandemic produce the same sort of surge in visitorship in the Boundary Waters that it did in so many other national parks around the country?
Yeah, absolutely. There are many, many, many more people who had never been to the Boundary Waters, and of course, that comes with some challenges. People not as familiar with some of the leave no trace principles that are so important in places like the Boundary Waters. But it provided an awesome opportunity to introduce a bunch of people to this fabulous place. And I think it says something really important, that in moments of crisis, the respite was places like the Boundary Waters.
Yes.
Respite was the outdoors. And that's so valuable on so many different levels. And I don't think we value that so much as a culture writ large. But that to me speaks volumes about who we are and what we need as people.
People talk about touching grass.
Yeah, right.
Touching grass and water. Right? In the Boundary Waters.
Go jump in a lake,
Right?
And while I haven't been to the Boundary Waters, I am a huge fan of national parks. We have visited many national parks, and you're exactly right. It is my place of joy. It is a place of respite. And so let's dive into why it's important to pay attention to what's happening in the Boundary Waters. So Congress recently overturned the 20-year mining withdrawal that had protected more than 225,000 acres of federal land surrounding the Boundary Waters, reopening the door for the proposed Twin Metals copper nickel mine. Can you explain what happened and why the conservation groups view this as such a pivotal moment?
And we're looking at you, Pete Stauber. I'm calling you out right now.
Pete. Yes. So we'll see if you keep this all in or not, but the Congressional Review Act was an interesting and dangerous legislative tool that was used to undo these important protections. So, ever since the second Trump administration came in, we knew that these protections would be targeted, that the Boundary Waters would be targeted, because the only mention of our state, despite everything that's happened to us, the only mention of Minnesota in the Project 2025 document was overturning these protections for the Boundary Waters.
Yep.
And so we knew that it was going to be an intense, handful of years. And indeed, all of 2025, we were in Washington, D.C., fighting off this, that, and the other attempt to legislatively overturn these protections and grant mineral leases to Twin Metals Minnesota, which is the company that seeks to do mining outside of the Boundary Waters. Essentially, Representative Stauber, tried to pass legislation that would, overturn the protections, but also these leases, give mineral leases for very specific terms with very generous lease terms. So in one instance, it was a 70-year lease term. For context, they're usually 10 years between,
Wow.
lease renewals.
Oh, wow.
One of them was lease terms that were perpetual, so no time limit on them. In every instance, it barred any judicial review of these leases, so on. And we were
He
able
just needs to go home. He needs to go home from Washington. Like, that is just vote for Trina Swanson for Congress in District 8. There's my plug. But I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No,
I
that's
digress.
okay. Yeah, he needs to touch a grass.
Jump in a lake. Pete Stauber, go jump in a lake.
So it was, it was really quite intense, but we were able to sort of beat back these legislative attempts that were predicted because they were must-pass bills. So things like budget reconciliation, appropriations, the National Defense Authorization Act, these are big vehicles that have to pass. And a lot of times these are the spaces where people will sort of throw spaghetti at the wall and hope that their, little add-on that favors this Chilean mining conglomerate doesn't get noticed, or it just slips in under the radar, or it's horse trading. We were able to beat all those things back. And then in January, we saw this Congressional Review Act play. And what made this unique is that the Congressional Review Act, which was introduced in 1996, it was really meant to give Congress oversight to agency rulemaking, give them a little bit of space to challenge those things. So if an agency, say the Department of Transportation, came out with a rule, there's a very specific process for rulemaking in the federal government. They would notify Congress, and then a member of Congress could introduce what's called a resolution of disapproval, which would basically be a piece of legislation that says, I disagree with this rule and I'd like it to be overturned. They then have 60 working days to pass that resolution through both chambers. And within those 60 days, if it does indeed pass in those 60 days, it's not subject to the filibuster. It's simple majority in both chambers. So it's a bit of a fast track sort of option.
Sneaky peeky.
Sneaky. Especially because the protections that we are defending, that they were done under a law called the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976. And so they have their own sort of governing rules and regulations, and they have never legally been defined as rules, these public land orders that come down under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. Because that's what this is. This mineral withdrawal, these protections, is a public land order. And so under the CRA, the Undersecretary of the Interior submitted to Congress these protections as if they were a brand new rule that the agency had just created, which then created the opportunity for Mr. Stauber to introduce a resolution of disapproval, which he did in early January. That is a completely unprecedented thing that's never happened before. And so we were off to the races trying to, kill this in the House. We ultimately lost that battle. And then our attention turned to the Senate, where it was a much, much closer effort. We needed 4 votes. We needed 4 Republicans. We ultimately got 2, but there was tremendous success in making people who thought that this vote would be easy, that this resolution would be easy to pass. We made people sweat. We made people from across the country, political offices, realize that this issue was in fact their issue to care about. We were clogging phone lines from Indiana to Oregon to Florida.
Yes.
I was clogging those phone lines too.
Yeah,
Thank
me
you.
too. I made calls every single day.
Oh, I appreciate that
They know
so
my
much.
voice at Stauber and Emmer's office.
I'm glad you could even leave a voicemail at Stauber's office. So it was, that was a little bit of a messy explanation, but it's quite wonky. I think the real summary is that Mr. Stauber worked with the administration to use a law in an unprecedented way to get what he wants, which was to overturn these protections. And the challenging thing about the Congressional Review Act is that Congressional Review Act resolutions are not subject to litigation, so you cannot sue, and no substantially similar rule can ever be put in place again. So in the next administration, if they were interested in putting in place a similar 20-year moratorium, they could not do that. Because of the use of the Congressional Review Act. So conservation groups, were, having a bit of a heyday with this, totally understandably, because it sets a really dangerous precedent for public lands across the country. There are other public land orders and mineral withdrawals. We are not the only one. And so all of a sudden, theoretically, any mineral withdrawal that's passed since 1996 could be up for scrutiny under the Congressional Review Act. And maybe it doesn't stop there. Or maybe things that have never been considered rules, other things, suddenly could be scrutinized under the Congressional Review Act. So it's really a Pandora's box that goes both ways. It's harmful, perhaps, with the politics of this administration, but it could also be used in future administrations. There are mineral withdrawals to, do fuel or like oil leasing, to create military bases, to do all sorts of things. They're not just for protecting public lands. So it's a really dangerous precedent. Well, and it's just one gross, unprecedented thing after another.
Yeah.
And it's like, how are you supposed to, just the rules are out the window. And that makes everyone's life much harder.
And it's the fucking money.
It's
all about the fucking money.
Yeah. It really is.
Yeah. So I'm gonna frame my next question because it's kind of important that people understand this framing. And since they're not going to be intellectually honest, we're going to be intellectually honest about this here. Twin Cities Metals is an American subsidiary of a Chilean mining company. So the mining company that they're opening these lands up to is not even an American company. So much for America first, as far as we're concerned with that. Supporters of the mine argue that America needs more domestic sources of critical minerals that modern mining can provide safely. Here's the issue. What's going to happen is this Chilean company is going to go in, mine these minerals, and they won't stay in the United States. Those minerals are going to be shipped to China to be smelted, and then we're going to have to buy them back at a profit. That is how this is going to work. And that is just a huge glaring issue that a lot of people are just not understanding. They're saying that we need these minerals, but we're not keeping these minerals. The Chilean company is sending them to China, and they're going to be making money off of Americans as we buy them back. And so there's this back and forth about we need more minerals, but then opponents are saying this particular location is simply too risky. First, why don't we address that whole Chilean mining company part of it? And then why do you believe the Boundaries Waters watershed is the wrong place for this kind of mining? I know that that's kind of broad, but I think you needed to understand the first part before you can jump on the second part.
Yeah, absolutely. So Twin Metals Minnesota is, just like you said, a wholly owned subsidiary of Antofagasta. Antofagasta is a Chilean conglomerate controlled by billionaire Jean-Paul Luksic Fontana / the Luksic family, which is the richest family in South America. So this is a foreign company extracting American public resources. End of story.
It's the fucking money.
It's
the fucking money.
And you're right. Antofagasta has secured multiple contracts with Chinese smelting companies. They're actually state-owned, so owned by Chinese state. And these contracts guarantee that Antofagasta has free processing of their copper. So it's a $0 investment for them to work with the Chinese and ship American metals to China. And they may be sold on the world market, where we can buy them back, or they're just going to stay in China. And I'm harping a little bit on the China piece because that is another message that we get that is in direct contradiction to this, we need domestic minerals question, which a lot of folks are sort of saying we need domestic supplies of minerals in order to effectively fight back against our enemies or perceived enemies, like China and Russia. And yet here we are handing these things over and not working with our allies the way we have historically worked with our allies to source critical minerals from places that have existing copper mining, where we could develop more technologies to make sure mines are really being maximized, in terms of their output. And
because
so
let's be clear that mining is part of Minnesota culture.
Oh,
mining
100%,
mining happens here. And so people shouldn't imply that you or either organization is anti-mining across the board. It's particular to the Boundary Waters, correct?
Yeah,
And the
that's
type of
right.
mining.
That's
Yes.
yeah, doubly right. So yeah, I mean, so many of the wilderness edge communities we were talking about earlier wouldn't exist without extractive industries like iron mining, taconite mining, the timber industry in the case of Grand Marais. You know, we have
Yeah.
had historical extraction, and like you said, yeah, the iron mining industry still exists in Minnesota. We have the whole Iron Range. What we work on at Save the Boundary Waters is, just how you frame this question. Wrong mine, wrong place. It's about
Hmm.
the nature of the mining itself, which is hard rock mining, which is uniquely toxic, especially in water-rich environments, and then the environment in which it's proposed, immediately upstream of America's most visited wilderness area and a watershed that also includes Canada's Quetico Provincial Park, Voyageurs National Park, and the water flows eventually all the way to Hudson Bay. That's uniquely interconnected, uniquely susceptible to this type of pollution. So wrong mine, wrong place. We're not talking about iron mining anywhere else. We're talking about copper mining in the headwaters of the Boundary Waters. So it's and I think people hide under this sort of idea that you can generalize about mining and being anti-mining or pro-mining, but that really negates the nuance of this issue, which isn't
Right.
isn't all that complicated. It's not so nuanced, but it's, you do have to sort of define mining that has really created so much for Minnesota and has done so much for Minnesota and continues to, in mining that we've never had before, and that we have the obligation, not only the right, but the obligation to be skeptical when these types of mines have an 100% track record of pollution, even in arid
I was going to say
desert
the data is
environments.
there. The data is there from previous mines that shows what the outcome very likely could be. So this isn't them proposing this could happen. This most likely will happen.
Yeah, it's not if, it's when. All of these mines have pollution impacts, no matter what. And, of course, when a company is working towards getting a project permitted, no company comes forward and says, yeah, ideally we'd only release this much pollution, but in actuality, based on what's happened before, will probably be about 40% over that limit. They don't say that in the course of permitting, but that's what the evidence has borne out, which is that, predicted pollution through the permitting process is always substantially lower than what actually occurs in those
Yeah.
landscapes.
And it's not just our country that it's going to affect. And
Yeah.
it's obvious in the name, the Boundary Waters, and you mentioned some of the Canadian areas as well. Are you working with any Canadian officials on any of this?
We have worked with the Canadian government, / the Canadian government has weighed in and expressed concerns in the past. There have been past comment periods where the government has sent in letters during the first Trump administration that went unanswered. There are these sort of joint groups that have citizens from Canada and the US side of the border in different segments across the border. And the one for this area is paying a lot of attention to this issue. So there are ongoing conversations with our neighbors to the north, and there's a lot of concern that because the Quetico Provincial Park that I managed is like the Boundary Waters on crack. I mean, it's so much bigger and it's
Yeah.
wilder. I mean, it is really, really a very, very backcountry experience. So, I think and we have a treaty to uphold. We have a 1909 treaty with Canada that basically says, we won't pollute yours if you don't pollute ours.
Yeah. Treaties don't mean anything to this administration. So,
No,
No.
it's true. Well, and there are other treaties that I'm sure we'll get into as well. Native treaties that are
yeah.
also relevant here.
Well, why don't you touch on that since you brought that up?
Sure, yeah. So the entirety of Minnesota's Arrowhead is 1854 treaty land. So it's where the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe maintain the right to hunt, fish, and gather. And this treaty right applies to the Fond du Lac, Ban, Grand Portage, and Bois Forte. And obviously, if the natural resources are disrupted via pollution of sulfate and acid and mercury, critical cultural crops like monoman or wild rice are at grave, grave risk. And the way that those pollutants work through the ecosystem means that they wouldn't be able to exercise their treaty rights? Why would you want to hunt, fish, and gather if it's all toxic to you and your family? So that's a critical element of this as well. These are the native lands of the Anishinaabe people.
And what people may not understand is that the Ojibwe do still spearfish on the lakes. A lot of times it's not uncommon for you to see spearfishing happening, and they do harvest wild rice, which is the monomen, which when you have wild rice soup, it's most likely coming from this part of the country. If you're getting authentic wild rice, a lot of the stuff that they say is wild rice is not the real wild rice that is harvested here. And I wanted to touch on one thing because this is really sticking in my mind. Historically, these mining operations are going to have budgeting changes over time because there's going to be cost adjustments. And historically, one of the things that we see cut right away is pollution mitigation as one of the first things to go.
Yeah, I mean, that's another reason why it's just a bad deal for Americans. If we are to learn from history, then we should know very well that companies come in, they take what they want, they pollute, they go bankrupt, and then taxpayers pay for cleanup. That's just how it is. That is modus operandi. So it's not only a economic hit from what potential impacts it would have to recreation or to other folks' livelihoods or why they live where they live, or the state being a, real hub for outdoor recreation writ large. It's also really a huge liability for Minnesotans
Yes.
from a financial perspective.
We're seeing conservationists all across the country pushing back on this, not just in the Boundary Waters, but in other areas. But unique to the Boundary Waters, where does the fight go from here? Are there still legal, administrative, public advocacy avenues available?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the CRA fight was such a big fight and such a big moment. And even though we lost the vote, there has been so much that has come out of that fight and that loss. People are so galvanized. I would argue the movement has never been stronger. We've got national partners who we've either never worked with before, we've worked with since our campaign began, 12 years ago, that are so deeply invested. Lots of attention, lots of media, lots of donations. I mean, we're stronger than we've ever been. And at the end of the day, the nice thing about being really singularly focused is we have one goal and we're going to stick with it until we accomplish it. We might be up against the wealthiest family in South America, but we've got the wind at our back despite this speed bump. I know that was just
Love that metaphor.
A little bit of a mix of metaphors, but
there's a lot of metaphors in this podcast.
Well, especially when you're talking about the Boundary Waters, you're like, we're in a hard portage and the mosquitoes are biting our hands, but we know a refreshing dip is on the other side, or, whatever. Yeah. But there are legal, administrative, and public advocacy avenues all available. And what I think makes us unique at Save the Boundary Waters is we've always pursued all of them. So we do litigation at the state level and the federal level. We do legislation at the state level and the federal level. We do local advocacy, statewide advocacy, and national advocacy. And in this situation, the Boundary Waters can be protected by the state of Minnesota. The federal government has failed us and will continue to fail us on public lands. And so, like in many other states, attention is turning to the state level politic. And we know how Minnesotans feel about the Boundary Waters. 70% of Minnesotans across partisan divides want the Boundary Waters permanently protected from this type of mining. Now, that's not reflected in our current politics, which is deeply unfortunate, but there are protective measures that the legislature could pass in the next biennium that would permanently protect state lands in the headwaters of the Boundary Waters from copper mining and actually ban the state from issuing leases or permits for hard rock mining in that area. And that is a critical piece of it because if anybody wants to open a mine in the state of Minnesota on public land, private land, state land, they have to have a Minnesota permit to mine. That's a document. It's a culmination of other things, other processes before it, but ultimately it's that document. And this bill would outlaw the issuance of that permit, basically protecting the area. And so it's really up to Minnesota. It's up to Minnesotans to fight for what they want to protect in their state, to make a lot of noise ahead of the midterm elections. The Boundary Waters has never been an issue that people have voted on necessarily. That's probably too sweeping of a statement, but over the course of this conversation about copper mining, I'd say we have the biggest opportunity right now to make sure that nobody running for office, well, and nobody in general, can come up for air on this Boundary Waters issue.
Yes.
And I think we're going to see that play out in some real ways that give us some real opportunities in the state legislature, but also hopefully with, whatever the next gubernatorial administration is, really demonstrating that it's not an issue that you can actually just sort of you could tuck away and ignore. It's to be addressed now, and the way to address it is through permanent protection.
So how we hooked up with you is a month ago, last month, we wrote a comprehensive article on the Boundary Waters, and Libby, who is your comms director, got a hold of it and reached out to us and asked if we'd be interested to have you on the podcast. Another person who got a hold of that article and asked to come on our podcast is Senator Tina Smith. And we actually interviewed her 2 weeks ago, and the predominant topic was the Boundary Waters. And what you just talked about, the whole state acting as a bulwark against this federal legislation, was something that she expressed hope in, because she even came out, Monica, didn't she even say at one point that she thought that the state would prevent it from happening altogether, that she had a reasonable amount of confidence that it would not happen?
She's certainly not ready to give up the fight, and she did believe that in the end there would be protections put in place. Well, we ask this of every guest. What is giving you hope right now?
What's giving me hope right now is that I think there's the sort of beginning of an understanding of how we, as public land protectors, as protectors of the Boundary Waters, have to deal in the reality of where we are, and that's the way that we conduct ourselves, the way that we show up, is what gives me hope. Because I think it's sort of similar with, Operation Metro Surge. It's really about how people show up. It's really about what you do in these these crazy liminal spaces where things are poorly defined, systems are failing you left and right that you relied on your entire life, whether you knew it or not, vis-a-vis government and the law and this, that, the other thing. And I'm really heartened by the way people show up for the Boundary Waters. I've said this a long time that I've been here, mostly because, formerly as the development director of this organization, the thing that's made my job doable is just how many people and entities show up so fully and so authentically for the Boundary Waters, no matter what. When we put out the call is heeded in a big way. And in a time when everyone's attention is divided between so many issues of tremendous importance and so many unprecedented this, that, the other things, the community of people, which is broad, that care about places like the Boundary Waters, and then the slightly smaller community of the professionals working on this stuff in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. Holy crap. Those, they're not to be messed with. There's a tremendous,
They're tireless.
movement and collection of people who are not going to let this happen. I agree with Senator Smith. I believe in my heart of hearts that the Boundary Waters will be protected.
Well, that's giving me hope, and I hope it's instilling our listeners with some hope, not just about the Boundary Waters, but about the people working together. And you mentioned, people showing up for Operation Metro Surge and people showing up for protections of lands that they love. And that's going to take all of us to do that, to make things better for all of us.
Yeah. And we've talked about a lot of heavy stuff in this podcast, so let's end things up on a lighter note. You've spent countless days in the Boundary Waters. Can you share with our listeners what's your perfect Boundary Waters day, or your favorite lake or favorite campsite, or maybe your favorite memory from a canoe trip?
Yeah, it's hard for me to pick a favorite. I know a lot of people have favorites, but I have a favorite type of campsite. So I guess as a perfect Boundary Waters day, I like maybe a half day paddle. You go from one lake to another. I tend to go on the west side of the wilderness just because my spot's off the Echo Trail. So a nice morning paddle, a slow morning with coffee, a few hour paddle that lands us at a campsite that has rocky outcroppings. So you can either jump off to go swimming, or just has swimming accessibility, but then it's shaded and nice and tucked away in the back. So you have the option of sort of sitting out on the rocks and being exposed to the elements, or being a little bit tucked away. You have a peanut butter and jelly tortilla you rock a nap, maybe a lake swim, you go exploring, maybe fishing, that kind of thing where there's a chunk of hard work and then there's a chunk of just settling and enjoying where you are. I do love Lake Agnes. I like Oyster Lake. I like Moose River, north and south, obviously. And I guess one of my favorite canoe trip memories, which it's weird. It's not going to seem like it should be like a favorite memory, but I guess it just stands out to me. It's an ongoing joke in my family that my dad has tried to kill his brother-in-law because we were deep in the woods with my uncle and my parents and my cousin, and my dad was chopping wood with a little hatchet, and he went to lodge it in the wood to be done, but it slipped his hand, spun, and hit my uncle in the forehead.
Oh.
Oh my God.
And everyone was like, "Duh," and it just sort of like bounced off his noggin, landed on the ground. We all sort of like,
oh my God.
and then blood started gushing from his head, inevitably. Missed his eye by like half an inch.
Wow.
We
Oh,
were
good
probably
Lord.
like at least 12 hours of paddling away from anybody. It was in the earlier aughts, so the cell service was, it's still not great now, but it was definitely worse, if not non-existent before. But it ended up being a shallow thing, so we just, duct taped some
Wow.
gauze to his forehead, and they took a picture
Duct
together
tape.
with the hatchet, and
That's how you fix everything. Duct tape.
yeah, duct tape,
Yeah.
spray a little index on it, and
Oh, Lord.
and we kept on keeping on. But that memory stands at the front of my mind in terms of gratitude that it wasn't worse, and just a funny family thing that comes up every now and again.
Oh my God. And where can listeners learn more about Save the Boundary Waters and get involved? As we pivot, I'm just going to
Yeah.
pivot from that.
Moving
From the
on.
hatchet in the head.
Yeah, Hatchet in the Head event. Yeah, folks can visit us at savetheboundarywaters.org. Reach out anytime to me or to our info at, try to be accessible and just chat with people. We love to hear from people. We are happy to answer questions. We have a lot of resources on our website, including how you can get involved, whether you're Minnesotan or you're from out of state. There are many ways that you can advocate for the wilderness by reaching out to your elected officials, getting involved
And
in donating. Those two are probably the biggest things you could do right now. And I'd also encourage you to, do some research on groups that are doing stuff with the midterms and the elections and getting the Boundary Waters out. That we have a 501c4 organization called the Save the Boundary Waters Action Fund. So if that's up your alley, you can also check us out at boundarywaters.action.org.
I will put both of those in the show notes so that people can find them.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Ingrid, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your passion and your expertise. We really appreciate the work you and your organization are doing. We can tell that you're passionate and that you find joy in your work, even though it's heavy work. And it just was really great speaking to you today.
Yeah, I'm so appreciative of the time and all you do to elevate really important issues in our state. I think, shows like yours are a critical piece of the puzzle as it's ever changing in the media landscape. So I'm honored to be here, and hopefully we'll chat again soon.
Yeah.
That would be great. And how much do I love the idea of little Ingrid growing up in Brooklyn and then ending up in the Boundary Waters. That's such a great transition story.
Yeah,
And
that's crazy times.
Whether someone has paddled through the Boundary Waters or has only seen photos like me, and it's on my list, I will be sure to go. That's a retirement bucket list. It's one of those places that reminds us that it is worth protecting. So thank you for helping us better understand what's at stake.
My pleasure.
For our listeners, if you are finding meaning in the stories we're sharing, if something moves you, challenges you, makes you see the world a little differently, please like, comment, and share. It helps more than you know.
And follow us everywhere at The Politics Chicks on Substack, Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook.
Thanks for being a part of our community. Keep shining your light so we can find each other in the dark.
And remember, we're stronger together. Thank you again, Ingrid. It was so
Thanks,
great
Ingrid.
talking to you today.
Thanks.
Bye, all.